The Hill. Possibly the only YouTube channel that spams out more videos than Tim Pool. You've got Saagar, who is supposed to represent the right. You know, the social conservative who's a borderline socialist. And then you have Krystal Ball, who is unapologetically a socialist. But you know what? That's okay. I am not a libertarian. I like to watch a good Jimmy Dore rant every once in a while. Sometimes I even actually like to watch videos where Kyle Kalinske plays a 10-minute long news clip and then provides 1 minute of commentary. I guess my main problem with The Hill's YouTube channel is half of the videos are only 6 minutes long. You see, I'm not a big YouTube watcher. I'm more of a listener. I like to listen to these videos about politics while I cook, while I work on my YouTube videos, while I work out or play video games. So it's kind of a pain in the ass when you barely started something and the YouTube video is already over. So when I saw that Krystal Ball and Saagar decide to do a 14-minute long debate over the issue of looting, I thought, why not do a review?
There's been discussion about white nationalists, and look, there has been some like fomenting of people trying to create.
It's like Twitter.
Well, why wouldn't the white nationalists use all of the things that are going on right now to try and recruit people? Days of nonstop looting, setting fire to buildings, and killing police officers is not exactly encouraging racial harmony. Even worse, the media in corporate America seem to be more sympathetic to the looters than to their victims. If black people want to have a race war and destroy the country while our leaders refuse to do anything about it, then what other choice does that leave for the non-blacks?
You're right, which is that monolithically trying to paint any of the violence in the looting and the rioting as just part of one group or trying to separate it out is just, look, this is a very complex development. I actually happen to think that it doesn't even need to be Antifa or looting. It can just be opportunistic, sociopathic criminals.
While I agree that the role of Antifa is minor, I have to disagree that the looters are just lone criminals trying to take advantage of the situation. It's obvious that the looting is being coordinated by gang members.
Damn, he got
Now the media loves to say things like, looters are not the same as these peaceful protesters, but the reality is it's more complicated than that. Number 1. To non-blacks, civil rights was a movement during the 50s and 60s led by MLK and Malcolm X. It ended when the Civil Rights Act was passed and MLK and Malcolm X were both assassinated. Number 2. To black people, though, the civil rights movement never ended. New leaders kept emerging. Leaders like Larry Hoover. Number 3. Larry Hoover formed the Gangster Disciple Street Gang in Chicago in the late 60s. In 1973, Hoover ordered Andrew Howard to kill 19-year-old William Pookie Young. The hit was ordered because Pookie had allegedly stole drugs from the gang. Pookie was murdered and Larry Hoover was convicted of orchestrating it. Hoover would later be convicted of numerous other crimes related to his gang leadership, which continued for decades while he served his life sentence in prison. Number 4. To understand how revered Larry Hoover and other infamous gang leaders are to black people, consider the fact that Kanye West urged President Trump to issue a pardon to Larry Hoover back in 2018. If even a conservative, Trump-supporting black person like Kanye West is an admirer of Larry Hoover, what does that say about black culture? Number 5. Even gangster rappers are often viewed by blacks as civil rights figures. Consider when Black Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney proposed a bill in 2005 that would have added records pertaining to Tupac Shakur and his murder investigation into the U.S. National Archives. Number 6. In Black culture, civil rights and criminality have become intertwined together. They are two sides of the same coin. This is why the heroes of Black Lives Matter are often also criminals. It's why Black Lives Matter activists demand more than just police accountability. They want reforms that would make things easier on criminals. Number 7. Are some people just protesting peacefully? Yes. Are some people just looting? Yes. Is there no connection between the looting and the protest? No. They are absolutely linked.
I would not describe looting as violence. Looting is property damage, but it is not violence.
So 1 second before I know that you have some thoughts on that, Krystal. I think that anybody who says that would have to then justify and tell me why it's okay, why former officer David Dorn, who was a captain in the St. Louis police and who was a security guard outside of a pawn shop, was shot dead last night by looters. And I think it's very convenient in order to play act revolution from somebody's home and not have to deal with the very real consequences of business owners getting the just absolutely beaten in the streets with no protection, of people like David Dorn, who was killed in cold blood by these criminals.
Now, I happen to live in a pretty diverse area in my city. There are a lot of Black people who live where I live. There have been some big protests and some looting, but not as bad as in a lot of these other cities. So I went to my local grocery store yesterday and I saw that there was only one self-checkout open. Are you kidding me? You're going to have just one self-checkout open during a pandemic? So I asked an employee who worked there, what's the deal with this? Why are all the self-checkouts closed? Well, she shut them all down because everyone's just stealing now. Not hardcore looting, just refusing to pay for groceries anymore. How are these stores going to stay open if this keeps going on? And don't tell me that it's because people are desperate. We have food stamps in the United States. There is no reason for anyone to have to steal food. The looting and the violence is horrible. It's terrible that Black officer was murdered by looters. But unfortunately, it's probably just the dramatic tip of a massive submerged iceberg of more petty types of crime that are going to result from this.
However, I would ask the question, who started the looting? And where was the moral outrage over the looting by Congress of the public purse to bail out Wall Street in 2008, to bail out big corporations this time around? Where was the outrage about that?
What an unbelievable shitty take. Were the congressional bailouts of the rich a pile of dog shit? Yes. Did they amount to looting of taxpayer money? Yes. Does that justify Black people looting these stores? No. It just makes a bad situation even more horrible. This is an opinion I would expect to hear from a 6-year-old. Well, Jimmy threw a rock at me first. And you know what? As obscene and unfair those congressional bailouts were, I would say that this looting is worse. It's worse because people are dying due to this. The most important thing in any society is to maintain the rule of law. Is it any surprise that the same neoliberals who benefited from this massive theft of taxpayer dollars are the same ones defending the looters? I guess that Krystal Ball is unable to conjure up the idea that if we consistently adhered to a rule of law, then perhaps those neoliberals would not be able to get away with looting our economy.
looting. Bernie Sanders actually had a great tweet that we can throw up to this regard. The richest 400 Americans sit on $3 trillion, the size of the entire UK economy. The billionaire class pays a lower tax rate than people living paycheck to paycheck. The looting of America has been going on for over 40 years, and the culprits are the ultra rich. And I don't see, this isn't directed at you because I do see it from you, but I don't see the moral hand wringing about that violence, about that looting, which amounts to a much greater threat to America and to regular American citizens than the property destruction by and large that I have seen in this.
So you're telling me there's been absolutely no outrage over these bailouts? Are you telling me that you haven't made 15 YouTube videos every day nonstop complaining about these bailouts for months now? Are you telling me that Saagar has not gone on the Tucker Carlson show and expressed outrage over these bailouts to Tucker's audience of millions of people? And yes, while it may involve less money, the black riots are more outrageous because people are losing their lives. As a leftist, I would expect you to appreciate the idea that money is not as important as human lives.
You know, and we also have to say who started the violence. Wasn't protesters who started the violence. It was police who started the violence. And look, we've talked before about how...
That's not true. That's not true. The first violence was against Target. And no.
Who murdered George Floyd?
Stop. Just stop. Who started it is not a political argument. Just because one police officer did a bad thing somewhere does not mean that everyone gets to loot and burn every store across America. Krystal Ball, please just stop with the whataboutism. What about the bailouts? What about the police starting it? Whataboutism is the absolute cancer of political debates.
Yes, but in regards to the protests, the violence began whenever they looted the Target and burned down an affordable housing complex and much of Minneapolis. So, look, I think that the conversation around who started looting is fine.
Saagar, hold on a second here, because we've talked about this, and you and I, we both see both of the worlds at this point, right? You see the left world, I see the right, we see both the split screens. And in the right world, there's grab every most horrific example of protester violence that you can find, that gets clipped and shared a million times. In the left world, it's the most unconscionable examples, of which there are many, of police violence, of which I count tear gas and rubber bullets. And I'm quite sure that if you were to calculate the number of protesters hospitalized because of police violence, you would come out with much greater numbers.
This is a false equivalency. Police are allowed to use violence. That is why the police exist. We give a monopoly on violence to the police to maintain order and enforce the laws. We do this so that they can protect our rights. It is the protesters who cannot use violence. Police can use reasonable amounts of violence to do the following things. Number 1. Arrest and handcuff people who break the law. Number 2. Prevent rioting and looting. Number 3. Use deadly force if it's necessary to protect human life.
This is not to say that anyone should justify violence from anyone, but I find it very convenient when we only fixate on the worst actors among the protesters. And why do we let the police off the hook? Well, I'll tell you why. Because that violence is normalized and it is justified in our society. That state-sponsored violence is normalized.
Yes, if you commit a crime, the normal thing that happens is the police should arrest you. If you resist arrest, you can expect them to use violence to get you restrained. If this were not to be normalized, we would simply live in a lawless society. This is what I don't understand about the left when it comes to the police. What exactly is it that you want? Are you going to be like Vaush and say that we should simply abolish all property rights? Anyone can just take your shit without any consequences?
And I agree. I mean, look, on this show, I think the billionaire class is completely complicit. And they're the ones who have been looting this country for 40 years. I agree completely with that statement. But the answer to looting is not looting itself. And it's not the justification of crime and of looting, and especially like people against David Dorn. And I'd also say, if you want to stack up the amount of people with actual bullets inside of them as a result of these violence and rioting, it is police officers across the country who have far more actually inside of them recovering in hospitals, some in the ICU right now.
Pretty base response. Compare how reasonable and consistent Saagar's take is compared to what Krystal Ball has been saying this entire time. I mean, we're 9 minutes into this 14-minute video, and this has been the first rational thing that's been said.
And so if we look in this context and we think about looting and we think about the way that we can structure society, I also find it very strange that a bunch of people, Marxists and Trotskyites, who called out Nikole Hannah-Jones as a tool of the billionaire class in order to cynically divide this country along racial lines, now all find themselves standing in solidarity because they seem to agree with the sentiment that we're an irredeemably racist nation. Why is it that Amazon, Citibank, and all of the cultural elites, people like Nikole Hannah-Jones, are totally on board with these protests and even with much of this violence? Because that every single day that we're talking about this, every single day that we're having these riots and we're having this violence and we seem to perpetuate the idea that we are just such a horrific racist nation, which is just not true. No country on earth has done more to atone for its racial mistakes than the United States of America.
100% correct. It is the neoliberals who defend black looting. They do not care if America burns. They are citizens of the world.
And the last thing you said, I think, is the most telling. You said our own people. I don't know what the fuck you mean by our own people. I don't identify with the people of my country any more than I do with the people of the rest of the world.
The more small businesses torched just paves the way for more chain restaurants financed by private equity money to replace them. If America's economy self-destructs, the neoliberals can just take their wealth elsewhere.
However, I don't think you can ignore the fact that race is still very much alive and well as a major issue, and that anti-Black sentiment is still alive and well as a major issue within society and specifically within the criminal justice system, which is why you see such an overwhelming number of young Black men criminalized over and young brown men criminalized over white people. So I don't think that we can ignore race and class and the way that the two intersect.
First off, I don't even necessarily agree that brown people are significantly more likely to be incarcerated than whites. Hispanics, as a demographic group, are much younger than whites, and they tend to be of pretty low socioeconomic status. If you adjust for those things, I think you would find that the Hispanic crime rate is not all that much higher than whites. The biggest issue with Hispanic versus white crime is the tendency for Hispanics to form gangs. For example, most of the trafficking of drugs across the border and throughout the United States is organized and overseen by Hispanic prison gangs. There are all of these people in government, in Hollywood, in the Black community, and in the media, people like Krystal Ball, who always come to the defense of Black criminals. Is it possible, Krystal Ball, that by doing this, you're encouraging this behavior? Is it possible that entitled narcissism is cultivated in Black people by our laws, our culture, our society, which incessantly obsesses over the so-called oppression of Blacks?
So here's some of the data. For every 10,000 white Americans who are arrested for a violent crime, 4 are killed. For every 10,000 Black people who are arrested for a violent crime in America, 3 are killed. It's actually lower. If you look at the non-white police officers are no less likely to use lethal force against minorities than white officers. And the U.S. incarceration rate in the United States is lower than at any time since 2008 and is lower in the lowest level in 20 years. There are 1/3 fewer Black Americans in American prisons today than there were in 2006. So to say as if the problem has gotten worse since then. And actually, the shooting of unarmed people, again, is something that only occurs in 6% of cases. The vast majority of people who are killed by police officers have a gun or a knife on them and are using it at the time. So there is not an epidemic of police violence on this level that we need to talk with actual informed statistics when it comes to this.
You've covered stop and frisk in New York. You've covered in other cities as well that implemented that, and how overwhelmingly who was stopped, black and brown people. I mean, I was looking at, there's so much data on this.
This is the best response you have to these statistics? Stop and frisk? You do know that Mayor Bill de Blasio ended stop and frisk, right? People's businesses and life savings are being wiped out by these looters. You're saying that that's okay because 10 years ago, some black people in New York City were minorly inconvenienced with stop and frisk in an attempt to get guns off the street? So, to give my overall impressions of this debate, Saagar seemed pretty consistent and reasonable, and he was able to cite to actual statistics. Krystal Ball seemed like an unhinged lunatic who wants to abolish the institution of the police. Anyways, that's all I've got to say for today's video. If you enjoyed it and you're not already subscribed to my channel, please help support small YouTube by subscribing. Thank you.